Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights, settling into that perfect pillow indent, and taking a leisurely stroll back in time to a London shrouded in gaslight and propriety. Imagine, if you will, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone streets, the distant chime of Big Ben, and the faint scent of coal smoke mingling with the delicate perfumes of elegant ladies. You're there, a hopeful young man or woman in a society where a single misplaced glance could dictate your entire future, where love was often less a fiery passion and more a carefully orchestrated social contract. Let's be real, you probably wouldn't survive a week trying to date in this era without accidentally causing a scandal or proposing marriage to someone's potted fern. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported not just to a different time, but to a different mindset one, where every social interaction, especially those involving the opposite sex, was fraught with unwritten rules and hidden meanings. Forget swiping right or a casual coffee date. In 19th century London, the pursuit of a partner was akin to a complex chess match, each move carefully calculated, each glance scrutinized. This wasn't a world of casual hookups or even straightforward declarations of affection. No, this was a world where reputation was everything, where a woman's virtue was her most prized possession, and a man's standing often depended on the suitability of his match. Historians still argue whether the perceived rigidity of Victorian courtship was a genuine reflection of moral superiority or simply a sophisticated system designed to maintain social order and class distinctions. As you step onto these hallowed, if slightly grimy streets, you quickly learn that dating as we understand it simply didn't exist. Instead, there was courtship, a highly formalized process with distinct stages, each requiring meticulous adherence to etiquette. Picture yourself dressed in layers of heavy fabric, perhaps a high collar digging into your neck, or a voluminous skirt impeding your stride, constantly aware of unseen eyes. You couldn't just chat up someone you found attractive at the local pub, not if you valued your good name. For a woman, an unchaperoned conversation with an unmarried man was a scandalous act, potentially rendering her unmarriageable. For a man, approaching a woman without a proper introduction from a mutual acquaintance was a colossal social faux pas, akin to showing up to a black tie gala in your pajamas. This was a society obsessed with appearances, and the appearance of impropriety was often as damaging as the act itself. One mainstream historical fact you'll quickly absorb is that the structured nature of Victorian courtship was largely a response to the rapid urbanization and social mobility of the industrial age. As people moved from close-knit rural communities to anonymous cityscapes, new rules were needed to manage interactions and protect reputations in a less familiar environment. And here's a quirky tidbit: to avoid the appearance of direct flirtation, many women carried a small calling card case and would surreptitiously slip their card into a gentleman's hand when they were accidentally brushed against in a crowd, implying an invitation to call. Of course, you had to hope they were actually interested and not just clumsy. It was all about plausible deniability, a charming little game. The reality of this system, however, was that genuine emotional connection often took a back seat to practical considerations like financial stability and social standing. Love was certainly a desirable outcome, but it wasn't the primary driver for marriage in many circles. You might find yourself at a grand ball surveying the room not for a kindred spirit, but for a suitable alliance. The pressure was immense, a constant hum beneath the polite chatter and rustle of silk. It makes your modern dating woes seem like a walk in the park, doesn't it? At least you can text someone back without worrying about causing a family feud. The marriage market of 19th century London wasn't just a social construct. It was an economic engine humming with the quiet anxieties of parents and the hushed hopes of their eligible offspring. You as a participant quickly grasped that your future, and indeed the future of your entire family, could hinge on a successful match. This wasn't about love conquering all. It was about alliances, legacies, and the often brutal realities of financial security. For a woman, marriage was practically the only respectable career path. Without it, your options were severely limited. Governess, companion, or God forbid a life of spinsterhood dependent on the charity of relatives. No pressure, right? Just your entire existence hanging in the balance while you try to make polite conversation over lukewarm tea. Imagine the young ladies fresh out of the schoolroom being presented to society, essentially put on display at balls and social gatherings. Their parents, like shrewd investors, would be scrutinizing potential suitors not just for their charm, but for their prospects, their lineage, and their income. A good catch wasn't necessarily the most handsome or witty man. It was the one with a solid inheritance, a respectable profession, and perhaps a title or two. Conversely, for a gentleman, marrying well meant securing a dowry that could bolster his own estate or linking his family to a more influential one. It was a symbiotic relationship, though perhaps not always a romantic one. You might find yourself assessing a potential partner's property deeds almost as much as their personality, a practice that seems utterly bizarre to us, but was perfectly logical then. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this economic reality is the significance of the dowry. A woman's dowry was a sum of money, goods, or estate that she brought to the marriage, essentially an advance on her inheritance. This was a crucial factor in attracting a suitable husband, particularly for women from the gentry or aristocracy. A large dowry could offset a lack of beauty or charm, while a small one or none at all could severely limit your options, consigning you to a life on the shelf. Conversely, the groom's family would often settle an annuity or jointure on the bride, providing her with an income should she become a widow. These were not romantic gestures. They were intricate legal and financial agreements hammered out by lawyers before the vows were even exchanged. It's a far cry from splitting the bill on a first date, isn't it? Though I suppose the financial anxieties are still there, just in a different guise. Here's a quirky tidbit to lighten the mood. Some parents, desperate to secure a good match for their daughters, would hire marriage brokers, essentially professional matchmakers. These individuals weren't just introducing people, they were essentially selling a package deal highlighting assets and downplaying liabilities, much like a real estate agent trying to sell a slightly too small house with charming character. You can almost hear them now. Yes, Lord Featherbottom is 87 and prone to fits, but his estate encompasses 3 counties. Historians still argue whether these transactional aspects of marriage undermined genuine affection or simply provided a stable framework within which affection could eventually grow. It's a chicken and egg scenario. Did love lead to marriage, or did marriage with its shared responsibilities and intertwined lives often lead to a form of love, even if it wasn't the passionate kind we idealize today? You might observe young couples at social events engaging in polite, almost performative conversations, acutely aware that every word exchanged, every gesture made, was being weighed and judged by their respective families and the ever-watchful eyes of society. The pressure to make a good impression, to present oneself as a desirable prospect, was immense. It was a constant tightrope walk where one misstep could have catastrophic consequences for your social standing and financial future. You certainly wouldn't find anyone asking, "What are we?" after a few dates. The "what we are" was usually meticulously defined by lawyers long before the first blush of romance. With the economic realities firmly in place, you now find yourself immersed in the intricate world of courtship rituals. A tightly choreographed dance where every step was measured, every glance calculated. This wasn't a spontaneous blossoming of affection. It was a carefully executed social performance designed to filter out the unsuitable and bring together the compatible. Imagine trying to express your interest to someone while being constantly under the watchful eye of a dowager aunt, with the sternness of a schoolmistress and the eyesight of an eagle. It truly was a tightrope walk, often performed without a safety net. The very first step, the initial introduction, was paramount. You couldn't just walk up to someone and say hello, even if you'd seen them at every ball for a month. A proper introduction had to be facilitated by a mutual acquaintance of good standing. This person, often a matriarch or an established socialite, would present you to the object of your interest. Think of it as a social seal of approval, vouching for your character and eligibility. Without this formal endorsement, any attempt at conversation would be considered an impertinent intrusion, signaling a distinct lack of breeding. One mainstream historical fact is that this system of formal introductions reinforced the rigid class structure of Victorian society, ensuring that interactions generally remain within established social circles. It was a gatekeeping mechanism, plain and simple. Once introduced, the real dance began. Conversations were expected to be polite, superficial, and entirely devoid of personal opinions or strong emotions. You might discuss the weather, the latest opera, or the brilliance of a recent sermon, but never politics, religion, unless you were trying to subtly hint at your own piety or anything remotely controversial. Heaven forbid you reveal too much of your personality too soon. It was a delicate art of small talk designed to gauge compatibility, not through shared passions, but through shared adherence to social norms. You'd find yourself using phrases like "indeed" and "how delightful" far more often than you'd ever imagined possible. Here's a quirky tidbit: some gentlemen eager to show off their intellectual prowess without actually saying anything too bold would carry a small, elegantly bound volume of poetry or classical literature. If a lady expressed even a fleeting interest in a particular author, he might, with practiced casualness, accidentally leave the book behind for her to find, hoping she'd see it as a subtle invitation to intellectual discourse. It was a literary breadcrumb trail leading to, well, hopefully a future conversation, not just a lost book. Historians still argue whether this performative politeness stifled genuine emotional connection or merely delayed it, allowing for a more reasoned assessment of character before deeper feelings were engaged. Perhaps they believed a slow burn was more sustainable than a flash in the pan. For women, the tightrope walk was even more precarious. You had to appear charming and agreeable, but never too forward, intelligent, but not too intellectual, lest you intimidate a potential suitor, accomplished, but not so much that you seem to neglect your domestic duties. It was a constant balancing act, a subtle negotiation of societal expectations. You might practice your polite smile in the mirror, ensuring it conveyed just the right amount of demure interest without tipping over into unseemly eagerness. Meanwhile, the gentleman would be trying to appear confident and established, but not arrogant, attentive, but not possessive. It was exhausting just thinking about it, wasn't it? Makes you appreciate the simple directness of a modern dating app, even with all its own quirks. Having navigated the tightrope of initial introductions, your next strategic tool in the peculiar courtship of 19th century London was the Mediorna, calling card. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was your social passport, a miniature envoy of your reputation, your social standing, and your intentions. Imagine the weight of an entire social interaction resting on a small rectangle of embossed cardstock. You'd certainly think twice before just scribbling your number on a napkin. The ritual of calling cards was intricate and highly formalized. When you as a gentleman wished to make a call on a lady you had recently been introduced to, you didn't just show up. You would leave your calling card at her residence first, usually with a butler or a footman. The card itself was typically plain, perhaps, with your name engraved in elegant script. If you were married, your wife's name might appear below yours. The corner of the card could even be folded in specific ways to convey messages. A top right corner, folded down, indicated a personal visit, while a bottom left fold might mean congratulations. It was a subtle, almost secret language that only the initiated understood. One mainstream historical fact is that the rise of the calling card system coincided with the growth of a more defined urban middle class who sought ways to formalize social interactions in an increasingly complex society. It was a way to maintain decorum and order. For the lady receiving a calling card initiated a delicate decision-making process. If she wished to encourage the gentleman's attention, she would return his call within a few days, either by leaving her own card again, often with a specific fold, or by receiving him in her drawing room. If she didn't return the call, or if her servant informed him that she was not at home, despite clearly being there, it was a polite but firm rejection. This system of polite refusal was genius in its subtle cruelty. No direct confrontation, just the quiet dismissal of a potential suitor. You'd be left wondering if she was actually out or simply out of interest. A bit like being left on red in the modern world, but with far higher stakes and fancier stationery. Here's a quirky tidbit about calling cards. Sometimes gentlemen would leave 2 cards for a married couple, one for the husband and one for the wife. If he was calling on an unmarried daughter, he'd leave his card for the mother and another for the daughter, as it was the mother who officially received callers for her unmarried girls. It was a small detail that spoke volumes about the strict hierarchies and gender roles of the time. Historians still argue whether the formality of the calling card system fostered a sense of respect and genuine anticipation, or if it simply created an impenetrable barrier to spontaneous human connection. Was it a beautiful dance or a suffocating cage? Perhaps a bit of both, depending on your perspective and your intentions. You can imagine the nervous anticipation of a young man dressed in his finest hand, trembling slightly as he hands his card to the stern-faced butler, hoping for a favorable response. Or the lady discreetly observing the cards left on the silver tray in her hall, deciphering the folded corners and contemplating her next move. The calling card was the first tangible step towards a deeper acquaintance, the silent promise of a future interaction, or the quiet declaration of disinterest. It was a far cry from the instantaneous gratification of a text message, requiring patience adherence to protocol and a keen understanding of unspoken social cues. It truly was a high-stakes game of paper-based poker. With the calling card ritual successfully navigated, you now faced another omnipresent fixture in Victorian courtship, the chaperone. Forget any hope of a private moment, a stolen kiss, or even an unobserved conversation. The chaperone was society's ever-present eye, a living, breathing firewall designed to protect a young woman's virtue and, by extension, her family's reputation. It's like trying to have a romantic dinner with your parents, sitting at the next table, furiously taking notes on your every move. The tension was palpable. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was an ironclad rule. No unmarried woman, particularly one from a respectable family, was allowed to be alone with an unmarried man outside of specific, highly supervised settings. The chaperone was usually an older married female relative, an aunt, a mother, or sometimes a trusted family friend who possessed an unwavering sense of duty and often a formidable stare. They were not there for polite company. They were there as vigilant guardians, hawk-eyed sentinels against any hint of impropriety. One mainstream historical fact is that the strict enforcement of chaperonage was a direct reflection of the era's obsessive concern with female purity and the social consequences of even a whiff of scandal. A fallen woman was irrevocably ruined. Imagine trying to convey your deepest affections or gauge the true feelings of your beloved, while Aunt Mildred knitted furiously in the corner, her needles clicking a rhythmic, judgmental accompaniment to your every strained conversation. Every walk in the park, every visit to a museum, every afternoon tea, all were conducted under the watchful gaze of this third party. Any prolonged eye contact, any lingering touch, heaven forbid, or any topic of conversation deemed too intimate, would be met with a cough, a pointed comment, or a sudden change of subject. It was an art form really trying to communicate volumes with a mere inflection or a subtle shift in posture, all while maintaining an air of utmost decorum. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some chaperones were so zealous in their duties that they were nicknamed dragon ants. It was said that a particularly strict chaperone could detect the merest hint of romantic interest from across a crowded ballroom, simply by observing the angle of a gentleman's head or the subtle flush on a lady's cheek. Their vigilance was legendary, and their disapproval could spell instant doom for a budding romance. Historians still argue whether the presence of chaperones genuinely prevented moral transgressions or merely forced courting couples to develop incredibly elaborate and subtle methods of communication, making the game even more thrilling, if infinitely more challenging. Perhaps the forbidden fruit tasted all the sweeter when Aunt Mildred wasn't looking directly at you. For the young lady, the chaperone was a constant reminder of the societal expectations she was bound by. For the gentleman, it was an obstacle course of social etiquette, forcing him to prove his honorable intentions beyond a shadow of a doubt. There was no casual Netflix and chill in Victorian London. It was more like tea and twitch, with you twitching nervously under the chaperone's unblinking gaze. It certainly put a premium on wit and ingenuity, as you had to find ways to express genuine interest without ever crossing the line into anything remotely suggestive. It makes you almost grateful for the simplicity of having to invent excuses to leave a party early, just to avoid a long, drawn-out goodbye. Almost. With the ever-present chaperone casting a long shadow over most social interactions, you quickly learn to appreciate the subtle, almost clandestine opportunities afforded by medium in public parks. These sprawling green spaces, manicured and dotted with promenades, offered a precious sliver of freedom within the rigid social structure of 19th century London. They weren't exactly a free-for-all, but they did provide a slightly more relaxed environment for polite encounters where a carefully orchestrated chance meeting might just be possible. Imagine yourself strolling along a winding path in Hyde Park, perhaps, with a demure parasol to shield you from the sun or a top hat jauntily angled against the breeze. The air is filled with the murmur of polite conversation, the distant laughter of children, and the clip-clop of hooves from passing riders. This was a place to see and be seen, to display your latest fashions, and to perhaps, just perhaps, catch the eye of someone interesting. While the chaperone was still very much present, the open-air setting and the sheer volume of other people offered a degree of anonymity and a sense of lightness that was often absent from the more confined spaces of drawing rooms. One mainstream historical fact is that public parks initially developed for leisure and recreation inadvertently became crucial venues for discreet social interaction and courtship, especially for the middle classes who didn't have large private estates for promenades. Here a gentleman might accidentally cross paths with a lady he admired, allowing for a brief, seemingly spontaneous conversation. The chaperone would of course be hovering nearby, but the wide open space and the constant flow of people made it harder for them to control every whispered word or lingering glance. You might practice your polite nods and just so smiles, ready for that fleeting moment of interaction. It was all about plausible deniability, a charming little charade that everyone implicitly understood. A gentleman might offer a lady his arm for a short portion of the walk, a highly formal gesture of courtesy, but one that allowed for a moment of closer proximity and hushed conversation before the chaperone cleared her throat with alarming precision. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some desperate young men, knowing that direct approaches were forbidden, would strategically lose an item, a glove, a handkerchief, or even a small book of poetry in the path of a lady they wished to engage with. Her returning the item would provide a perfectly acceptable excuse for a brief exchange of polite words, allowing for a few precious seconds of interaction under the guise of good manners. Of course, you had to hope she didn't just step over it. Historians still argue whether these seemingly innocuous park encounters were truly innocent, or if they were subtly subversive, offering a nascent form of personal agency in a highly restrictive society. Were they merely polite interactions, or were they tiny rebellions against the iron grip of etiquette? You'd often see couples strolling, maintaining a respectful distance, the gentleman walking slightly ahead or to the side of the lady, never quite hand in hand unless they were formally engaged. The entire scene was a masterclass in controlled interaction. It was a refreshing breath of air, both literally and figuratively, compared to the stuffy formality of indoor calls. But don't mistake the fresh air for complete freedom. The invisible chains of propriety were still very much there, just a little looser. It made you appreciate the small victories, the fleeting moments of shared space before retreating back into the more confined social arenas. Having perhaps exchanged a fleeting glance in a public park, your next step in the intricate dance of Victorian courtship might involve a silent, fragrant language, the language of flowers, or floriography. This wasn't just about giving someone a pretty bouquet. It was about sending coded declarations, expressing emotions that couldn't possibly be uttered aloud. Imagine trying to confess your undying love, or even just your mild interest without saying a single word, relying instead on the subtle symbolism of a rose or a violet. It was like a botanical version of emoji, but far more elegant and prone to misinterpretation. Floriography was a wildly popular craze in 19th century London, fueled by numerous published dictionaries that listed the specific meanings attributed to various blooms, herbs, and even weeds. Every flower had a meaning, every combination a message. A red rose, of course, meant passionate love, but a yellow rose could mean jealousy or friendship, depending on the context. A violet signaled modesty, while a lily of the valley whispered of a return to happiness. You could construct entire silent conversations with a carefully arranged posy, a secret missive delivered under the very nose of your ever-present chaperone. One mainstream historical fact is that, while the language of flowers had roots in ancient traditions, its widespread popularity in the Victorian era was largely due to the restrictive social norms that limited overt expressions of emotion. Imagine you as a hopeful suitor, carefully selecting each bloom for a small nosegay, considering not just its beauty, but its precise semantic weight. You might include a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, a few forget-me-nots for true love, and perhaps a heliotrope for devotion. Then with a practiced casualness, you would present it to the lady, hoping she possessed the same flower dictionary as you. The anxiety of whether your message would be understood, or worse, misinterpreted, must have been excruciating. What if she thought your offering of rude disdain meant you were just being polite? Oh, the horror! It was a beautiful but potentially treacherous form of communication. Here's a quirky tidbit. Not only did individual flowers have meanings, but the way they were presented mattered too. If a flower was given upside down, its meaning was reversed. If a ribbon tied the bouquet to the left, it referred to the giver, if to the right, to the recipient. Even taking a flower from the bouquet and pinning it near your heart or tossing it carelessly away sent a clear message. It was a silent ballet of botanical signals. Historians still argue whether the language of flowers was a truly effective communication tool or merely a delightful parlor game that added an extra layer of romantic intrigue to courtship. Did it truly convey deep emotion, or was it just another elaborate performance in the grand theater of Victorian social life? You might spend hours poring over your flower dictionary trying to craft the perfect floral sentence, or anxiously dissecting a bouquet you received, wondering if that innocent-looking sprig of thyme courage was a subtle hint or just a random addition. This intricate system allowed for expressions of affection, longing, or even gentle reproach, without ever having to utter a single word that could be overheard or deemed improper. It was the ultimate exercise in romantic subterfuge, a charming if sometimes confusing way to navigate the peculiar landscape of 19th century London love. It makes you almost miss the days when you could just send a carefully curated Spotify playlist to convey your feelings. Almost. If the language of flowers offered a silent botanical dialogue, then fan flirting was its equally subtle yet far more dynamic counterpart. Imagine yourself in a grand ballroom, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive perfume, the music a gentle waltz. You as a lady hold a delicate fan, not just for cooling yourself, but as a sophisticated instrument of communication. With a mere flick of the wrist, a rapid flutter, or a slow, deliberate closing, you could convey messages that politeness absolutely forbade you to speak aloud. It was like a secret telegraph system operated right under the nose of any unsuspecting chaperone. The fan was an essential accessory for Victorian women, both practical and decorative. But its true power lay in its ability to become an extension of a woman's unspoken desires and rejections. There were entire guides published on the language of the fan, detailing specific movements and their precise meanings. For instance, holding your fan open wide meant, "Wait for me," while slowly closing it signaled, "I promise to marry you." Dropping it implied, "I belong to you." But slowly fanning yourself could mean, "I am married," or "I am engaged," depending on the context. One mainstream historical fact is that this elaborate form of nonverbal communication flourished precisely because of the highly restrictive social environment where direct speech from women, particularly regarding romantic interest, was considered unseemly. Imagine the subtle tension you, a young woman, spot a handsome gentleman across the room. A rapid, nervous flutter of your fan might signal, "I am interested," or "I am available." If he returns your gaze, you might then slowly close it, indicating a deeper, more serious sentiment. Meanwhile, he, if astute, would be watching your every movement, trying to decipher your intentions. It was a high-stakes game of visual charades where misinterpretation could lead to awkwardness, or worse, a reputation for being overly bold. And if you didn't want to engage, a sharp, decisive snap of the fan, closed or holding it shut and resting it against your cheek, could effectively communicate, "No," or "I'm not interested," without uttering a single rude word. It was the ultimate "leave me alone" gesture, delivered with exquisite grace. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women would use the fan to strategically hide their faces when laughing or smiling at a gentleman, allowing for a more expressive moment than was usually permitted. It provided a brief, almost intimate shield behind which a true emotion could momentarily escape. Historians still argue whether this elaborate fan language was truly effective in conveying nuanced messages, or if it primarily served as a delightful, playful element of Victorian social life adding to the mystique of courtship rather than genuinely facilitating deeper communication. Was it a tool of liberation or just another gilded cage? You'd find yourself observing others intently trying to pick up on their fan signals, or perhaps practicing your own subtle gestures in front of a mirror. The graceful opening, the delicate flutter, the decisive snap each movement had to be perfectly executed to avoid sending the wrong message. It was a sophisticated art form, mastered by few but understood by many. It certainly makes your modern dating app profile, with its carefully curated photos and witty bios, seem almost pedestrian by comparison, doesn't it? At least you don't have to worry about accidentally proposing marriage with a too enthusiastic fan flutter. Beyond the subtle hints of flowers and fans, the etiquette surrounding gloves and handshakes offered another layer of nuanced, often nerve-wracking communication in 19th century London's peculiar dating landscape. Physical contact, especially between unmarried men and women, was severely restricted, making even the simplest touch a potentially loaded gesture. Imagine a world where a handshake wasn't just a greeting, but a carefully calibrated expression of social standing, intent, and even burgeoning affection. It added a whole new dimension to simply saying hello. Gloves were an almost universal accessory for both men and women in polite society, worn both for fashion and as a barrier against direct skin-to-skin contact. A lady would rarely, if ever, remove her gloves in mixed company, particularly when being introduced to a gentleman. To offer a bare hand was considered overly familiar, even uncouth, especially if you weren't already intimately acquainted. The very act of shaking hands therefore became a formal ritual, almost a test of propriety. One mainstream historical fact is that the strict adherence to wearing gloves and limiting physical contact underscored the era's emphasis on decorum and the protection of female modesty, serving as a constant visual reminder of social boundaries. When a gentleman was introduced to a lady, a formal brief handshake, often gloved, was the standard. The touch was light, fleeting, and purely ceremonial. A gentleman might lightly clasp a lady's gloved hand, perhaps bowing slightly, but never lingering. To hold her hand for too long or to apply undue pressure would be considered a breach of etiquette, signaling an unseemly eagerness or even a lack of respect. It was a delicate dance of restraint. You'd find yourself wondering, did my handshake linger too long? Was that pressure acceptable? The anxiety was real. Here's a quirky tidbit: some gentlemen, when truly smitten, might try to convey their affection during a handshake by applying a very slight, almost imperceptible pressure or a lingering touch on the lady's gloved hand. If she returned it, however subtly, it was a secret acknowledgement of mutual interest, a tiny spark of connection in a world of enforced distance. It was the ultimate blink and you miss it moment of intimacy. Historians still argue whether these subtle physical interactions were truly understood as romantic signals or if they were largely performative gestures, adding to the overall theatricality of Victorian courtship. Did they genuinely convey deeper feelings, or were they just part of the elaborate social game? For women, deciding whether to even extend a gloved hand or how firmly to grasp a gentleman's was another nuanced decision. Too firm a grip might suggest a lack of feminine delicacy, while too weak could be seen as timid. And if a gentleman dared to try and kiss a lady's hand, a very rare and bold gesture outside of specific formal contexts, it was almost always done to the gloved hand, preserving the ultimate barrier of propriety. It makes you realize how much unspoken communication happened in a world where direct physical expressions of affection were so severely curtailed. Imagine trying to build a romantic connection with only your gloved fingertips. Beyond the fleeting touch of gloved hands and the silent messages of fans, your presence in 19th century London's dating scene reveals another powerful unspoken language: dress codes. Your attire wasn't just about fashion. It was a complex signaling system, instantly communicating your social status, your family's wealth, your marital availability, and even your intentions. Imagine trying to find a date, but every stitch of clothing you wear is broadcasting personal details about you before you even open your mouth. It was a sartorial shorthand legible to anyone with a discerning eye. For women, the nuances were particularly acute. The cut of a gown, the fabric's quality, the amount of lace or embroidery all spoke volumes. A young unmarried woman would typically wear lighter, more delicate colors, like pastels with fewer jewels and simpler silhouettes indicating her unclaimed status. Darker, richer fabrics and more elaborate embellishments were reserved for married women or older dowagers. The shift from a light morning dress to an elaborate evening gown for a ball was not just a change of outfit. It was a transition in social potential from demure daywear to a subtle invitation for polite attention. One mainstream historical fact is that the rapid evolution of fashion in the Victorian era, driven by industrial advancements and the growth of fashion magazines, made these visual cues more intricate and constantly shifting. A gentleman's attire, while seemingly less varied, was equally symbolic. The quality of his broadcloth, the cut of his waistcoat, the gleam of his boots, these were all indicators of his financial standing and attention to detail. A perfectly tied cravat, a pristine top hat, and immaculate gloves signaled a man of means and respectability. A disheveled appearance, even a slightly frayed cuff, could instantly mark him as a man of questionable character or dwindling fortunes, effectively taking him off the eligible list for any discerning family. You wouldn't be caught dead in wrinkled linen if you were hoping to impress. Here's a quirky tidbit: the color white was profoundly significant. For a bride, a white wedding gown famously popularized by Queen Victoria symbolized purity and innocence, a powerful statement of her virtue. However, a young unmarried woman wearing an all-white ball gown might also subtly signal her availability in pristine character, much like a blank canvas waiting for its artistic impression. Historians still argue whether the elaborate and often uncomfortable Victorian dress codes were truly a reflection of moral purity, or if they served primarily as a means of enforcing social hierarchy, clearly delineating who was in and who was out at a single glance. Did the clothes make the man or woman, or merely the appearance of them? You'd find yourself meticulously selecting your ensemble for every social outing, knowing that each detail would be scrutinized. For a woman, a slightly décolleté neckline at a ball might be a daring, subtle invitation, while for a man, a perfectly tailored coat could project an air of confident success. It was a silent conversation played out in fabric and form a constant negotiation of modesty and allure, status, and ambition. It makes you realize that while today's dating apps might use carefully chosen photos back then, your entire outfit was your living, breathing profile picture. With your dress codes perfectly aligned, you now plunge headfirst into the social season. A dizzying, exhausting, and utterly essential whirlwind of opportunities for courtship in 19th century London. This wasn't just a series of parties. It was a concentrated high-stakes period, typically from April to July, when the aristocratic and gentry families moved to London from their country estates, specifically to participate in a relentless succession of balls, dinners, opera visits, and afternoon teas. Imagine a non-stop, months-long networking event, but instead of professional connections, you're looking for a life partner. Sleep became a distant memory. For young ladies, the social season was their formal entry into the marriage market. After a debutante presentation to the monarch, if you were high enough in the aristocracy, you would be thrust into a relentless schedule of engagements. Every ball was a chance to dance with eligible gentlemen, every dinner party an opportunity for polite conversation, every opera visit a showcase for your cultured sensibilities. The sheer volume of interactions was designed to maximize the chances of finding a suitable match before the season concluded and everyone retreated back to their country estates. One mainstream historical fact is that the London social season intensified significantly in the 19th century, becoming a highly formalized institution driven by the desire to consolidate wealth and maintain social purity among the elite. As a gentleman, you were expected to attend these events with equal fervor, demonstrating your eligibility, charm, and social grace. You'd spend your evenings navigating crowded ballrooms, your days making formal calls, and attending gentlemen's clubs, all with an eye toward making a suitable connection. The pressure wasn't just to find our wife, but the right wife, one who would enhance your family's standing and perhaps bring a substantial dowry. It was a constant performance, a strategic deployment of your best manners and most engaging conversation topics. Here's a quirky tidbit about the season: families would sometimes rent grand townhouses in exclusive areas like Mayfair, specifically for the duration of the season, investing heavily in entertaining and fashionable new clothes, all to present their daughters in the best possible light. It was a colossal financial undertaking, often putting families into debt, simply for the chance of a good match. Historians still argue whether the intense, concentrated nature of the social season truly fostered meaningful connections, or if it merely created a superficial environment where appearances and strategic maneuvers overshadowed genuine compatibility. Was it an efficient matchmaking machine, or just a glamorous facade? You'd find yourself mentally ticking off potential suitors or prospects, evaluating their conversational skills, their dance moves, and discreetly trying to ascertain their financial standing. For every glittering ball, there was an underlying current of anxiety and calculation. The constant late nights, the pressure to always be on, and the subtle competition between families made the social season an exhilarating yet utterly draining experience. It certainly wasn't a time for quiet introspection. It was a time for action, for seizing every fleeting chance to secure your future. Having plunged into the relentless currents of the social season, you now discover that many of your crucial interactions, especially with potential suitors, are confined to the highly controlled environment of the drawing room. This wasn't just a fancy sitting room. It was the formal heart of a Victorian home, meticulously arranged to facilitate polite conversation and subtle social maneuvering, all under the vigilant eye of family or chaperone. Imagine trying to get to know someone intimately while sitting on an ornate sofa surrounded by delicate porcelain and disapproving portraits. The drawing room was where formal calls were received, where afternoon tea was served, and where the delicate dance of courtship often played out. Everything in it was designed to project an image of respectability, taste, and affluence. The conversation within these hallowed walls was expected to be light, intellectual, and entirely unchallenging. You might discuss literature, art, music, or travel, but steer clear of anything too personal or emotionally charged. It was a place for mental fencing, not emotional outpouring. One mainstream historical fact is that the drawing room served as a crucial private space for regulated social interaction, allowing for the observation and assessment of potential matches in a seemingly informal yet strictly controlled setting. As a young lady, you would be expected to be at home to receive callers on specific days and times, usually announced by your mother's calling card. You'd sit poised, perhaps, with a piece of embroidery in your hands, ready to engage in polite conversation. For a gentleman, entering a drawing room felt like stepping onto a stage. You had to be impeccably dressed, your manners flawless, and your conversational topics carefully chosen to both impress and entertain. There was an unspoken time limit to these calls. Overstaying your welcome was a grave breach of etiquette, suggesting either a lack of understanding or, worse, an unseemly eagerness. Here's a quirky tidbit about these encounters. Some clever young ladies would strategically place certain books or sheet music on their piano or tables. Say a volume of Byron's poetry or a particularly complex piece of Chopin to subtly signal their intellectual interests or accomplishments to a discerning gentleman caller. It was a silent advertisement for their cultural capital. Historians still argue whether the extreme formality of the drawing room allowed for a deeper, more intellectual connection through controlled discourse, or if it simply stifled genuine personality and forced individuals to present a highly curated, often inauthentic version of themselves. Did it encourage respectful admiration or merely polite pretense? You might find yourself trying to convey a spark of wit or hint of genuine interest through a carefully phrased question or a knowing glance, all while maintaining an outward appearance of serene composure. The drawing room was a crucible for testing one's social dexterity, where every pause, every gesture, and every word was analyzed for deeper meaning. It certainly made casual, getting to know you conversations a much more arduous affair than simply grabbing a coffee. Once you'd established a modicum of interest through formal calls and drawing room encounters, the true backbone of Victorian courtship began to emerge: correspondence. Letters were not just a form of communication, they were a literary performance, a carefully crafted expression of sentiment, and often the primary conduit for a burgeoning romance. Imagine trying to build a relationship solely through handwritten notes, where every sentence was proofread, every word weighed for its precise meaning, and where the very stationery you chose conveyed a silent message. It was a far cry from the instant gratification of a text message requiring patience, eloquence, and a keen eye for nuance. For many courting couples, especially those separated by distance or strict chaperonage, letters were their only real opportunity for extended private conversation. These weren't hurried notes. They were often lengthy missives, sometimes bordering on mini essays detailing one's thoughts, feelings, and observations. A gentleman would carefully compose his letters, aiming for a tone that was respectful yet warm, demonstrating his intellect and honorable intentions. A lady in turn would craft her replies with equal care, aiming for a delicate balance of engagement and demureness, revealing just enough of her personality to encourage further correspondence without appearing too forward. One mainstream historical fact is that the increase in literacy rates and the efficiency of the postal service in the 19th century made widespread correspondence possible, transforming it into an indispensable tool for courtship. The content of these letters could vary wildly. Early in a courtship, they might be polite exchanges about social events or shared interests. As affection grew, they could blossom into heartfelt declarations of admiration, discussions of future hopes, and even subtle expressions of longing. But even then, propriety was paramount. Anything too overtly passionate or sexually suggestive would be considered scandalous and could lead to the immediate cessation of correspondence. You'd spend hours agonizing over a particular phrase, wondering if it conveyed warmth without being immodest or sincerity without being overly dramatic. Here's a quirky tidbit about these romantic epistles. Some individuals would include small symbolic tokens. Within their letters, a pressed flower, perhaps from a bouquet, received a snippet of hair or a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper with a coded message. These tangible additions added another layer of intimacy and secrecy to the written word. Historians still argue whether the enforced slowness and formality of correspondence led to more profound and considered expressions of emotion, or if it simply delayed the inevitable discovery of true compatibility or incompatibility that might have emerged more quickly through direct interaction. Did it deepen feelings or just prolong the agony of uncertainty? You can almost feel the anticipation of waiting for the postman, the thrill of receiving a letter, and the nervous excitement of breaking the seal. Each letter was a small, precious window into the other person's mind and heart, a gradual unveiling of personality that might take weeks or months to accomplish. It certainly made you appreciate the art of the written word and the powerful intimacy that could be forged across miles, one carefully penned sentence at a time. No emojis, needed just pure, unadulterated prose. From the structured sentences of correspondence, you now perceive another layer of Victorian courtship, the pervasive embrace of poetry and sentimentality. This wasn't just a preference, it was a deeply ingrained cultural expectation, a romantic ideal that permeated every aspect of expressing affection. Imagine a world where every gesture, every whispered word, and certainly every written missive was expected to be imbued with a delicate, almost ethereal romanticism. You'd find yourself penning sonnets to a beloved's eyebrow, or at least quoting them rather than simply complimenting their outfit. The era was awash with sentimental literature, tear-jerking novels, and most importantly, for courtship reams of poetry. Byron, Shelley, Keats, Tennyson. These poets weren't just literary figures. They were guides to expressing the inexpressible. A gentleman might meticulously copy out verses into a personal album for his lady, or even compose his own, however amateurish, as a demonstration of his refined sensibilities and deep feelings. For a lady, a well-chosen poetic quote in a letter or a wistful recitation at a social gathering could signal her sensitivity and romantic inclinations. It was an age where expressing emotions through verse was not only accepted, but actively encouraged as a mark of true depth. One mainstream historical fact is that the Romantic movement's emphasis on emotion, nature, and individualism heavily influenced Victorian ideals of love, shaping how people expressed and perceived romantic affection. Think of the sheer effort involved, hours spent poring over anthologies searching for the perfect lines that echoed your unspoken desires, or perhaps agonizing over a rhyme scheme for your own heartfelt, if slightly forced stanzas. The more flowery and emotionally evocative the language, the better. Subtlety in this particular realm often took a back seat to grand declarations and effusive praise. You were expected to put your heart on your sleeve, but only if that sleeve was embroidered with metaphors and similes. Here's a quirky tidbit. It wasn't uncommon for young women to keep autograph albums, or friendship albums, where gentlemen would write poems, draw sketches, or leave small, sentimental messages. These albums became cherished keepsakes filled with a tangible history of their admirers and social connections. Historians still argue whether this pervasive sentimentality in courtship was a genuine reflection of profound emotional depth, or if it sometimes veered into a form of performative emotionality where expressing appropriate feelings was more important than truly feeling them. Was it authentic passion or merely a societal script? You might find yourself trying to convey your earnestness through florid prose, hoping your intended understood the depth of your devotion, even if you hadn't exchanged more than 5 minutes of actual conversation. It was a beautiful, sometimes overwrought way to navigate the peculiar landscape of 19th century love, where words carried the weight of unspoken feelings and emotions, were often painted in broad poetic strokes. After navigating the intricate world of formal calls, veiled glances, and poetic declarations, you finally reach a pivotal stage in Victorian courtship, the engagement. This wasn't merely a promise to marry, it was a formal proclamation, a public declaration of intent that irrevocably shifted your social standing and the nature of your relationship. Imagine the collective sigh of relief from both families as the engagement was announced. The pressure, at least for a time, would lift. An engagement was typically a period of formal betrothal, allowing the couple to become better acquainted in a more relaxed, though still chaperone setting. Once engaged, the couple was allowed greater liberties, such as walking out together unchaperoned, though still with discretion, and their correspondence could become more openly affectionate. It was a testing ground for compatibility, a chance to transition from the polite formal courtship to a more intimate understanding of each other's personalities and habits. One mainstream historical fact is that the engagement period, while varying in length, was seen as a crucial time for the couple to prepare for the practicalities of married life, including financial arrangements and setting up a household. The announcement of an engagement was a significant social event. It would be formally communicated to family and friends, often through a notice in a local newspaper or by a round of visits where the happy news was shared. For the families involved, it meant the successful negotiation of a complex social and financial transaction, ensuring the continuation of lineage and the consolidation of wealth. For the engaged couple, it meant that the anxious uncertainty of courtship was finally over, replaced by the exciting anticipation of impending matrimony. You could almost feel the weight of expectations settling, but now it was a shared weight. Here's a quirky tidbit during the engagement. It was common for the engaged couple to exchange gifts. The gentleman would traditionally give his fiancée a ring, more on that in a moment, and she might present him with a sentimental gift, perhaps a finely embroidered handkerchief, a hand-knitted waistcoat, or a personalized watch fob. These gifts were tangible symbols of their commitment and affection. Historians still argue whether the formal engagement period genuinely fostered deeper emotional bonds through increased intimacy, or if it sometimes revealed irreconcilable differences that had been masked by the strictures of earlier courtship, leading to broken engagements, a serious scandal in itself. Did it solidify love or merely provide a prolonged opportunity for cold feet? You'd find yourself experiencing a new kind of freedom, a tentative stepping away from the most rigid social constraints. You could now openly acknowledge your affection for your betrothed, even perhaps dare to dream of a future together that was less about social obligation and more about shared happiness. The engagement was the tangible promise, the public commitment that set you on the path to becoming husband and wife. With the engagement now formally announced, your attention turns to its most tangible and enduring symbol: the ring. This wasn't merely a piece of jewelry. It was a potent emblem of commitment, a public declaration of ownership, and a constant reminder of the vows soon to be exchanged. Imagine the weight of all those expectations resting on a tiny circle of metal and stone glinting on your finger. The tradition of exchanging rings as a symbol of betrothal has ancient roots, but in 19th century London, it gained particular significance. While styles varied, the most common engagement ring featured a single diamond, a stone valued for its durability and rarity, symbolizing everlasting love. The diamond, often set in gold or silver, was usually cut in a simple, elegant style, reflecting the era's taste for understated luxury before the more flamboyant cuts of the later centuries. One mainstream historical fact is that the popularization of diamond engagement rings for the general populace largely took off in the Victorian era, a trend significantly bolstered by the discovery of new diamond mines in South Africa. For the gentleman, selecting the ring was a significant undertaking, often involving discreet inquiries into his fiancée's taste and his own financial capabilities. It was a visible sign of his earnestness and his ability to provide. For the lady wearing the ring was a constant signal to the world, "I am taken, my future is secured." It offered a new sense of protection within society, signifying that she was under the care of a prospective husband. You'd find yourself gazing at the ring not just for its beauty, but for the profound shift it represented in your life's trajectory. Here's a quirky tidbit: before the widespread popularity of diamonds, posy rings were common, featuring short poetic inscriptions or sentimental phrases engraved on the band. Another popular style was the regard ring, where the gemstone spelled out a word like ruby, emerald, garnet, amethyst, ruby, diamond, spelling out regard. It was a secret message worn openly, a charming little code that only the initiated understood. Historians still argue whether the increasing emphasis on a visible, valuable engagement ring contributed to a more materialistic view of marriage, or if it simply provided a necessary and beautiful public affirmation of a serious commitment. Was it about love or about showing off? You can almost feel the gentle pressure of the ring on your finger, a constant reminder of the vows that awaited you. It was a physical manifestation of a promise, a miniature monument to a future shared, and a powerful symbol in a world where symbols spoke volumes. It certainly made the commitment feel very real, very tangible, unlike a fleeting profile match on a dating app. With the engagement ring sparkling on your finger, your attention now shifts to the intensely practical, yet often unspoken underpinnings of Victorian marriage. Dowries and settlements. This wasn't the stuff of romantic poetry. This was the cold, hard reality of economics, the financial foundation upon which a respectable marriage was built. Imagine trying to plan your future with someone knowing that a significant portion of the negotiation wasn't about shared dreams, but about property deeds and investment portfolios. It was a stark reminder that love, however fervent, often needed a solid financial bedrock. The dowry was the wealth, goods, or property that a woman brought to her marriage. For the gentleman, it was a crucial consideration, as it could significantly bolster his own estate, provide funds for his career, or simply contribute to the establishment of their new household. For a woman, a substantial dowry increased her attractiveness as a marriage prospect, sometimes even compensating for a lack of beauty or social connections. Without a dowry, a woman's options were severely limited, making it difficult for her to secure a husband of good standing. One mainstream historical fact is that dowries, while ancient in origin, remained a vital component of upper and middle-class marriages throughout the Victorian era, ensuring economic stability for the newly formed family unit. Conversely, the gentleman's family would typically establish a marriage settlement or jointure for the bride. This legal agreement ensured that the wife would have a guaranteed income or property in the event of her husband's death, protecting her from destitution. It was a safeguard for the woman, acknowledging her lack of independent earning power in society. These financial arrangements were meticulously drawn up by lawyers long before the wedding vows, often requiring extensive negotiations between the families, sometimes more intricate than the courtship itself. You might find your parents discussing percentages and annuities with more fervor than they discussed your feelings. Here's a quirky tidbit: some families, particularly those with several daughters and limited funds, would try to marry off the eldest daughter quickly and advantageously, using her dowry as a stepping stone to secure better matches for the younger sisters. It was a strategic family investment, hoping for a cascading effect of good fortune. Historians still argue whether the pervasive emphasis on dowries and settlements fostered a more pragmatic and stable approach to marriage, or if it reduced marriage to a mere financial transaction, potentially stifling genuine affection and prioritizing wealth over compatibility. Was it a necessary evil or a stifling burden? You'd realize that while passion might ignite a spark, it was the cold, hard cash and legal documents that truly cemented the union. These financial negotiations often revealed the true priorities of the families involved, and sometimes the prospective partners themselves. It was a world where love often ran concurrently with ledgers, and emotional bonds were strengthened by financial security. With the financial underpinnings of your engagement firmly established, you now confront what was arguably the ultimate hurdle in 19th century London courtship: parental approval. This wasn't a casual request for a blessing. It was an absolute necessity. Without it, particularly for a woman, marriage was virtually impossible, and any attempt to defy your family's wishes could lead to social ostracization and profound personal hardship. Imagine proposing to someone only to realize that their parents hold the ultimate veto power, regardless of your mutual affection. It was a power dynamic that rendered individual desires secondary to familial strategy. Parents, especially the patriarch, held immense authority over their children's marital choices. Their primary concern was not necessarily their child's romantic happiness, but the maintenance or improvement of the family's social standing, financial stability, and legacy. A prospective suitor or bride would be rigorously vetted, not just for personal character, but for their family background, financial prospects, and even their health history. Any perceived flaw in these areas could lead to a swift and unequivocal rejection from the parents, regardless of how deeply their child might feel. One mainstream historical fact is that patriarchal authority in the Victorian era was deeply entrenched, reflecting a societal structure where family units were seen as economic and social enterprises first, and emotional ones second. Imagine the agonizing wait for a suitor as he sought an audience with a formidable father, knowing that a single interview could make or break his future happiness. Or a young woman desperately trying to convince her mother of a gentleman's worthiness, knowing that a dissenting parental voice could condemn her to a life of spinsterhood. The pressure on both sides was immense, transforming genuine affection into a bargaining chip in a larger game of social advancement. You couldn't simply elope without facing severe social repercussions, potentially being disinherited or disowned. The fear of such an outcome was a powerful deterrent. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some desperate suitors, unable to gain a father's approval, would resort to writing impassioned letters directly to the mother of the lady they wished to marry, hoping to appeal to her maternal instincts and sway her influence over the stern patriarch. It was a risky move, but occasionally it paid off. Historians still argue whether the absolute power of parental approval protected young people from unsuitable matches, or if it often condemned them to loveless unions for the sake of social and economic expediency. Did it foster stability or stifle genuine love? You'd realize that while you might fall in love, the final decision often lay with those who had your best interests, as they defined them at heart, often prioritizing practicality over passion. It made the journey to the altar feel less like a sprint of love and more like a carefully negotiated treaty. Even with parental approval tentatively secured, you'd quickly realize that in 19th century London, your hot family background wasn't just a detail, it was your destiny. Your lineage, your parents' social standing, and your family's reputation were paramount, dictating who you could even consider as a suitable match and who would consider you. Imagine being judged not just on your own merits, but on the accumulated history and prestige, or lack thereof, of your entire ancestral tree. It was a system where pedigree mattered profoundly. The concept of good breeding was not just a metaphor, it was a perceived reality. Families of the aristocracy and established gentry meticulously guarded their bloodlines, viewing marriage as a means of consolidating wealth, power, and social position. Marrying beneath your station could bring shame and social ruin, while marrying above could be a formidable, almost insurmountable challenge. Even within the burgeoning middle-class, families aspired to improve their standing through strategic alliances, carefully assessing the social capital of potential in-laws. One mainstream historical fact is that the rigid class system of Victorian Britain meant that social mobility through marriage, while not entirely absent, was often an uphill battle, especially for those seeking to cross significant class divides. You might find yourself as a young man keenly aware of the social ladder, knowing that a partnership with a woman from a higher rung could elevate your own prospects, but also knowing that such a pursuit would be met with immense scrutiny from her family. As a young woman, your family's lack of a title or substantial land could immediately close doors to otherwise desirable suitors, regardless of your personal charms or accomplishments. Every introduction was a subtle interrogation of lineage, every conversation a quiet assessment of ancestral connections. It was a constant reminder that you were part of a larger family narrative, and your marriage would either uphold or diminish it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families, particularly those from ancient landed gentry, would boast not just about their wealth, but about the sheer age of their family lines, sometimes tracing their ancestry back centuries, even boasting about having ancestors who fought in medieval wars. It was a form of social one-upmanship based on historical longevity. Historians still argue whether this intense focus on family background fostered a sense of stability and continuity within the upper echelons of society, or if it created an insular elitist system that stifled individual choice and genuine connection. Did it preserve tradition or merely perpetuate snobbery? You'd learn that while personal chemistry might spark interest, it was the deep, often unassailable roots of family background that determined if that spark could ever grow into a flame. It made the idea of a simple love match feel almost naive a fantasy against the formidable wall of social expectation. Beyond social standing, another formidable, often unspoken consideration in 19th century London courtship was health concerns, particularly the fear of hereditary diseases. This wasn't about catching a cold. It was about the chilling prospect of passing on what were then poorly understood, yet visibly debilitating conditions to future generations. Imagine falling for someone only for your family to discreetly investigate their lineage for any hint of tainted bloodlines, a practice rooted in early, often misguided eugenics. It added a layer of scientific, albeit often superstitious anxiety to the already complex process of finding a mate. While germ theory was still in its infancy, observations of families plagued by conditions like consumption, tuberculosis, madness, or other chronic illnesses led to a pervasive fear of inheriting bad stock. A family with a history of such ailments might find their children deemed less desirable as marriage prospects regardless of their individual health. The fear was that the taint would be passed on, weakening the family line both physically and mentally. This concern was particularly pronounced among the upper classes, where maintaining strong, healthy heirs was crucial for the continuation of titles and estates. One mainstream historical fact is that the anxieties surrounding inherited diseases, though often based on incomplete medical understanding, significantly influence marital choices, leading to discreet inquiries into family medical histories. You might find yourself as a prospective suitor subtly questioning a family friend about the general health of a lady's relatives, or observing a gentleman for any telltale signs of frailty. For a young woman, the knowledge of a distant relative's nervous disposition or consumptive tendencies could cast a long shadow over her own eligibility. It was a form of preemptive genetic screening, albeit crude and judgmental, driven by a desire to secure a healthy future for one's descendants. Here's a quirky tidbit related to this. Families sometimes employed references or inquiries that went beyond financial standing, subtly probing into the medical histories of prospective partners, extended families looking for any skeletons in the genetic closet. A polite dinner conversation could quickly become a veiled interrogation about a distant uncle's delicate constitution. Historians still argue whether these health concerns, despite their often unscientific basis, were a pragmatic attempt to ensure robust offspring, or if they simply added another cruel dimension to social prejudice, unfairly penalizing individuals for genetic lottery. Did it promote health or merely reinforce stigma? You'd come to understand that beneath the glittering surface of balls and polite conversations, there was a deeply practical, sometimes cold assessment of biological suitability. Love might be blind, but Victorian parents certainly weren't when it came to their children's genetic prospects. It was a stark reminder that even in matters of the heart, the specter of disease could loom large, influencing fates and determining futures. Having navigated the intricate social and genetic evaluations, you now encounter a common yet frequently debated aspect of Victorian marriage, the age gaps between spouses. It wasn't unusual to see couples with quite disparate ages, often with the husband significantly older than his wife. Imagine a young woman barely out of her teens being courted by a man in his late 30s or 40s. It was a reality that shaped many marriages, leading to vastly different life experiences within the same household. While love matches certainly occurred, practicality often dictated these unions. For a gentleman, marrying a younger woman was often desirable. She was considered more pliable, less likely to have established opinions, and more fertile, ensuring the continuation of his lineage. For a young woman, marrying an older established man could offer immense financial security, social stability, and a quicker entry into a comfortable life than waiting for a younger man to build his fortune. One mainstream historical fact is that economic factors played a significant role in these age disparities, as older men often had the wealth and status that young women with limited economic independence sought for security. You might observe these couples at social events, the younger wife often appearing demure and attentive, the older husband radiating an air of established authority. The dynamic was clear: he was the provider and protector, she the dutiful, often admired partner. Conversations between such couples might seem formal, sometimes almost paternalistic, rather than the lively banter you might expect from modern partnerships. It made you wonder about the true nature of affection in these unions, if love blossomed from convenience or if it was simply a quiet acceptance of one's lot. Here's a quirky tidbit: some Victorian moralists surprisingly argued against excessively large age gaps, believing they could lead to incompatibility and unhappiness, even suggesting that such marriages might be more prone to infidelity. It was a rare crack in the facade of societal acceptance. Historians still argue whether these prevalent age differences reflected a pragmatic approach to societal stability, or if they primarily served to perpetuate patriarchal power structures, giving older men control over younger, less experienced women. Was it a matter of sensible arrangement or an unequal bargain? You'd come to understand that while personal preference played a part, the prevailing societal norms and economic pressures often steered individuals toward unions that might seem surprising by today's standards. It was a peculiar dance of age and expectation where youth and experience were often paired for mutual, albeit sometimes unequal benefit. Having observed the practicalities of age gap marriages, you now delve into the persistent tension at the heart of Victorian matrimony, the struggle between love matches and arranged marriages. While the rigid class system often pushed families towards strategic alliances, the burgeoning romantic ideal of marriage for love was gaining traction, creating a fascinating tug-of-war between tradition and emerging sentiment. Imagine a young woman torn between her heart's desire and her family's meticulously planned future. It was a dilemma that defined many lives. Historically, marriages were primarily economic and social arrangements, often negotiated by parents or guardians, with little input from the prospective bride and groom. Property, lineage, and social advancement were the primary considerations. However, as the 19th century progressed, the Romantic movement, coupled with increased individualism, began to popularize the idea that marriage should ideally be based on mutual affection and emotional connection. This wasn't to say that economics disappeared. It was more that love became a desirable complement to practicality rather than an entirely irrelevant factor. One mainstream historical fact is that while true arranged marriages, in the sense of forced unions, became less common, parental influence and societal pressures still heavily steered choices, making love matches often a luxurious outcome rather than a baseline expectation. You'd witness the subtle negotiations within families' parents attempting to steer their children towards suitable partners, often presenting a curated selection of eligible individuals, while young people, perhaps influenced by novels and poetry, yearned for a deeper connection. Sometimes affection genuinely blossomed within these arranged introductions. Other times, it was a desperate battle of wills between children seeking autonomy and parents seeking security. The stakes were incredibly high for everyone involved. Here's a quirky tidbit to satisfy both parental expectations and their own romantic leanings. Some young couples would engage in a form of arranged love match. Their parents would introduce them, the couple would then pretend to fall in love during a carefully chaperoned courtship, thus giving the appearance of a spontaneous romance while fulfilling the preordained family plan. It was a polite fiction everyone quietly understood. Historians still argue whether the growing emphasis on love and marriage genuinely empowered individuals or simply added another layer of emotional complexity to an already constrained social system, often leading to unfulfilled desires for those who couldn't achieve both love and security. Did it truly bring happiness or just more heartache? You'd come to understand that this was a transitional period where the old ways of marriage for property and position were slowly, grudgingly giving way to the seductive notion of love. The tension between these two ideals created a fascinating dynamic, forcing individuals and families to navigate a complex landscape where heart and ledger often collided. In the delicate tapestry of Victorian courtship, the shadow of a scandal loomed large, a terrifying specter that could swiftly and irrevocably lead to reputational ruin. Forget a bad breakup. In 19th century London, a single misstep, a hint of impropriety, or a whisper of gossip could destroy a woman's marriage prospects, and for a man severely damage his social standing. Imagine living in a society where your entire future could be undone by a single unverified rumor. For women, the consequences of scandal were particularly devastating. Her virtue was her most precious asset, and any blemish on it, real or imagined, made her unmarriageable. This could range from being seen unchaperoned with a man to receiving too many passionate letters to God forbid any suggestion of premarital intimacy. The double standard was stark. While men might face social censure, their reputations were rarely ruined to the same extent as a woman's. A gentleman might be considered a rake, but he could still marry well. A fallen woman could not. One mainstream historical fact is that the strict moral codes of the Victorian era placed an immense burden on women to uphold an unattainable standard of purity, with social consequences for deviation being far more severe for them than for men. You'd witness the hushed whispers at social gatherings, the sudden averted gazes, and the exclusion from invitations that mark someone touched by scandal. Families would go to extreme lengths to prevent even the slightest hint of impropriety from attaching to their daughters, often enforcing rigid chaperonage and restricting social interactions. For a suitor, being associated with a scandalous woman could also reflect poorly on his own judgment and character, potentially jeopardizing his own prospects. Here's a quirky tidbit. Society gossip was often spread through anonymous letters, sometimes called poison pen, letters which would circulate among the upper echelons, ruining reputations with malicious, often fabricated tales. These were the social media of their day, but far more insidious, as there was no way to trace the source. Historians still argue whether the extreme fear of scandal genuinely upheld moral standards, or if it merely fostered hypocrisy and forced individuals to live lives of constant pretense, suppressing natural inclinations for fear of social annihilation. Did it protect society or merely create a climate of fear? You'd come to understand that navigating Victorian courtship was not just about finding love, but about surviving a minefield of potential reputational hazards. The constant pressure to maintain an impeccable facade to avoid even the appearance of wrongdoing made every social interaction a high-stakes gamble. It certainly made you appreciate the relative anonymity and freedom of modern life, where a social faux pas rarely results in complete societal ruin. When the iron grip of societal rules and parental disapproval became utterly unbearable, a desperate measure sometimes emerged in 19th century London: elopement. This wasn't a romantic dash to Gretna Green for a quaint ceremony. It was a defiant, often reckless act of rebellion against family and social norms, carrying immense risks and potentially devastating consequences. Imagine choosing love, but knowing that choice could mean losing your family, your inheritance, and your entire social standing. It was a decision made only when all other avenues were exhausted. Elopement typically involved a couple secretly running away to marry without their parents' consent. This was often done when families vehemently opposed a match due to class differences, financial disparities, or personal animosity. While eloping meant immediate marriage, it also meant severing ties with one's family, forfeiting any inheritance, and facing severe social ostracism. For a woman, elopement was particularly perilous. She was essentially placing her entire future and reputation into the hands of her chosen man, with no legal or familial safety net if the marriage failed. One mainstream historical fact is that, while romanticized in literature, actual elopements were rare and often had dire social and financial consequences, making them a last resort for truly desperate couples. You'd hear hushed whispers of elopements, often sensationalized, recounting tales of secret carriages, midnight rendezvous, and hurried ceremonies in distant towns. These stories highlighted the romantic audacity of defying convention, but rarely delved into the stark realities of life afterwards. The couple would often face financial hardship, social isolation, and the immense burden of living without the support system they had abandoned. The perceived freedom of elopement often came at a very high price. Here's a quirky tidbit. The town of Gretna Green in Scotland became famous as a destination for eloping English couples because Scottish marriage laws were much more lenient. A couple simply had to declare their intention to marry before witnesses without parental consent or lengthy bans. It was the Las Vegas of its day for illicit unions. Historians still argue whether the act of elopement was a truly liberating expression of individual will against oppressive societal norms, or if it was often a naive and ultimately self-destructive act, driven by impetuous youth rarely leading to lasting happiness. Was it courageous or foolish? You'd come to understand that while the romantic notion of elopement might stir the heart, the reality was a brutal trade-off. It was a dramatic escape from one set of chains, often into another less visible, but equally restrictive set of circumstances. It underscored just how powerful the grip of family and society was in Victorian London, making genuine love a prize almost too precious to snatch at such a cost. While elopement offered a desperate, if risky, escape from an undesirable marriage, another even rarer and far more stigmatized path existed in 19th century London: divorce. This wasn't merely a legal separation, it was a devastating social earthquake, an almost impossible escape from the bonds of matrimony that carried profound consequences for all involved. Imagine a society where getting out of a bad marriage was akin to declaring yourself a pariah with virtually no hope of recovery. For much of the Victorian era, divorce was incredibly difficult and prohibitively expensive, accessible only to the very wealthy through an act of parliament. This meant each divorce required a separate, lengthy, and humiliating legislative process, making it a luxury few could afford. Even after the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made judicial divorce possible, the grounds for it were notoriously unequal. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery, but a wife had to prove her husband's adultery plus another matrimonial offense such as cruelty or desertion. This stark double standard reflected the era's patriarchal views on female morality and property rights. One mainstream historical fact is that the extreme difficulty and social stigma associated with divorce meant that many unhappily married individuals, particularly women, were trapped in their unions with no legal recourse. You'd hear whispers of divorced individuals often shunned from polite society, their names tainted by the scandal. For a woman, a divorce, even if she was the innocent party, almost certainly meant social ruin, economic hardship, and the loss of custody of her children. She would become a pariah, unable to remarry within respectable circles. For a man, while less socially damaging, a divorce still carried a significant stain on his reputation and could affect his professional standing. The pervasive societal belief was that marriage was a lifelong sacred bond, and its dissolution was a profound moral failing. Here's a quirky tidbit before the 1857 Act. The wealthy who sought divorce often had to first sue for criminal conversation, essentially adultery in common law courts, then pursue an ecclesiastical court separation, then finally lobby Parliament for a private act. It was a three-ring circus of public humiliation. Historians still argue whether the near impossibility of divorce contributed to the perceived stability of Victorian society, or if it merely forced countless individuals into lives of quiet desperation, enduring intolerable marriages for the sake of appearances and social survival. Did it preserve the sanctity of marriage or merely enforce misery? You'd quickly understand that for most, the marital vows were truly "till death do us part," regardless of personal happiness. The concept of a fresh start after divorce was largely unimaginable, making the decision to marry, even if driven by practicality rather than passion, one of the most utterly binding commitments you could ever make. If divorce was a rarely trod path, then the circumstances of widows and widowers presented a very different yet equally complex landscape for finding a second chance at love in 19th century London. Death, unlike divorce, was a natural if tragic part of life, and while mourning rituals were elaborate, remarriage for the bereaved was often expected, albeit under a new set of societal rules. Imagine navigating grief and societal pressure, all while subtly re-entering a modified version of the dating game. For a widow, the period of mourning was strictly defined, often lasting a full year or more, marked by specific mourning attire. deep black, then gray, then lavender. During this time, she was generally expected to withdraw from society. However, once the initial mourning period passed, remarriage was often considered desirable, especially if she was young, had children to provide for, or lacked independent financial means. A wealthy widow, particularly one with a jointure, remember those was an attractive prospect for a gentleman seeking to improve his fortunes. One mainstream historical fact is that for many women, particularly those from the middle and lower classes, remarriage after widowhood was an economic necessity, providing crucial financial support and stability for themselves and their dependent children. For a widower, the expectations were slightly different. While he also observed a period of mourning, it was generally less stringent, and he was often expected to remarry sooner, especially if he had young children who needed a maternal figure. A widower was often seen as a stable, experienced partner, and his eligibility was often enhanced by his established position and existing household. You'd observe that remarriage for widowers was often seen as a practical imperative, ensuring the continued smooth running of his domestic affairs and the proper upbringing of his offspring. Here's a quirky tidbit: it was considered highly improper for a widow to remarry before her full mourning period was over, sometimes even leading to social censure if she appeared too eager to move on. However, for a widower, a more relaxed approach was often taken, reflecting the double standards of the era. Historians still argue whether the social encouragement for widows to remarry, particularly those with inherited wealth, reflected a genuine concern for their well-being, or if it was primarily a mechanism to recirculate wealth and property within male-dominated society. Was it about care or control? You'd come to appreciate the nuances of these second chances, recognizing that while grief was real, societal expectations often propelled individuals back into the marriage market, albeit with different priorities, and often with a quiet understanding of life's impermanence. It was a bittersweet journey, blending sorrow with the hope of renewed companionship. Stepping away from the gilded drawing rooms and strict etiquette of the upper classes, you now glimpse the vastly different realities of working-class courtship in 19th century London. Here the rules were less formal, the stakes perhaps more immediate, and the pursuit of a partner driven by practical needs as much as if not more than romantic ideals. Imagine trying to court someone when your days are consumed by arduous labor and your evenings by the struggle for survival. For working-class men and women, courtship often revolved around shared work environments, local pubs, music halls, and Sunday outings. There were no chaperones, no formal calling cards, and certainly no dowries or marriage settlements in the same vein as the gentry. Relationships often began more casually with young men and women, meeting through factories, workshops, or in the crowded streets of their neighborhoods. Courtship involved shared leisure activities, simple treats, and perhaps a walk home after a shift. One mainstream historical fact is that economic necessity and the close-knit nature of working-class communities fostered a more direct and less formalized approach to courtship, where practicality and mutual support were paramount. You'd observe that physical proximity and shared experiences often led to relationships more quickly than the drawn-out rituals of the upper classes. A young couple might walk out together, spending time in public spaces, and their engagement might be marked by a simple promise or a shared commitment to save money for a future home. Marriage itself was often delayed until the couple could afford to set up their own household, however modest. This practical delay was a common feature reflecting the harsh economic realities. Here's a quirky tidbit. Bundling was a practice more common in rural areas, but with echoes in urban working-class life, where a courting couple would share a bed fully clothed and separated by a board or sheet to get to know each other through conversation without sexual impropriety. It sounds utterly bizarre to us, but it was a pragmatic way to save on fuel and light. Historians still argue whether the less formal nature of working-class courtship allowed for more genuine expressions of love and choice, or if it simply exposed individuals to greater risks and fewer protections in their romantic lives compared to their upper-class counterparts. Was it freedom or just a different set of constraints? You'd realize that while the grand narratives of Victorian romance often focused on the elite, the vast majority of Londoners found their partners through much simpler, more direct, and often more physically demanding paths. It was a testament to human resilience and the enduring desire for companionship, even in the harshest of circumstances. Delving deeper into the varied social strata of 19th century London, you encounter the often unseen, usually forbidden, and fraught reality of servant romances. Within the grand houses and bustling households of the aristocracy and middle class, a complex web of interactions played out, often leading to clandestine affections between domestic staff. Imagine trying to pursue a relationship when your every move is dictated by your employer, and privacy is an almost unheard of luxury. It was a tightrope walk with severe consequences for exposure. Life for servants was one of rigid hierarchy, long hours, and minimal personal freedom. Relationships between male and female servants, while natural, were often discouraged or outright forbidden by employers who feared distractions, gossip, or even the possibility of scandal. If a female servant became pregnant, she would almost certainly be dismissed, facing destitution and social ruin. Despite these formidable barriers, human connection persisted. Courtship among servants often took place in stolen moments, hushed conversations in hallways, fleeting glances in the kitchen, or quick walks outside during limited free time. One mainstream historical fact is that despite employer prohibitions, relationships and marriages among domestic servants were common, often facilitated by the close quarters and shared experiences of household life, albeit with constant risk. You'd notice the subtle flirtations, the shared jokes, and the quiet support that blossomed amidst the drudgery of daily tasks. A footman might try to catch the eye of a housemaid as he carried coal, or a cook might discreetly leave a treat for a scullery maid she favored. These relationships were often born out of shared hardship and mutual understanding, a stark contrast to the performative courtships of their employers. The commitment, when it arose, was often deeply felt, perhaps even more so because of the obstacles. Here's a quirky tidbit: some male servants, particularly footmen or valets, might try to use their relatively higher wages and access to their employer's discarded clothing to appear more eligible to female servants, subtly elevating their perceived status within the servant hierarchy. It was a form of internal class struggle played out in second-hand finery. Historians still argue whether the inherent power imbalance within master-servant relationships made genuine consensual romance truly possible, or if it often led to exploitative situations, particularly for female servants, at the hands of male superiors. Was it a tale of forbidden love or a stark reminder of social vulnerability? You'd come to appreciate the quiet resilience of those who sought companionship within the confines of rigid social structures. These were romances built on stolen glances and whispered words, a testament to the enduring human need for connection, even when it meant risking your livelihood. Having glimpsed the darker underbelly of desire and the stark realities of working-class love, you now turn your gaze to a more complex and often heartbreaking aspect of 19th century London's relational landscape: queer relationships. These connections, whether romantic or intimate, existed subtly, often hidden in plain sight, forced underground by severe societal condemnation and harsh legal penalties. Imagine trying to navigate love and affection in a world where your very nature was deemed a sin, a crime, or a debilitating illness, forcing you to express your deepest feelings in codes and whispers. It was a perilous existence, a secret garden constantly under threat of exposure. The prevailing Victorian morality was fiercely heteronormative, and any deviation from traditional male-female relationships was seen as profoundly unnatural and immoral. For men, homosexual acts were criminalized under laws like the Gross Indecency Statute, carrying severe punishments ranging from imprisonment to hard labor. For women, same-sex relationships were often dismissed as mere romantic friendships, or were simply not acknowledged as a possibility, rendering them invisible in the eyes of the law, though no less condemned by social norms if discovered. This pervasive atmosphere of disapproval meant that many individuals lived lives of profound secrecy and fear their true affections, confined to private spaces and coded interactions. One mainstream historical fact is that while the Victorian era saw the formalization of laws against male homosexuality, there was no specific legislation targeting female same-sex relationships, largely because such relationships were not even conceived of as a threat to the patriarchal order in the same way. You might observe the subtle signals: a man choosing to spend an unusual amount of time with a male companion, rather than seeking female company or two women sharing a private home and a close, almost familial bond that seemed to exceed mere friendship. These relationships often found refuge in artistic or intellectual circles, where a degree of bohemian eccentricity might offer a thin veil of protection. There were also more clandestine meeting places, hidden taverns, or private clubs where individuals could seek out like-minded souls, albeit at immense personal risk. The language used to describe these relationships was oblique, full of euphemisms and double meanings, designed to be understood only by those in the know. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some same-sex relationships, particularly among women, were framed as Boston marriages, a term coined later, but describing a phenomenon prevalent in the 19th century where two unmarried women lived together often for economic and social support, sometimes forming deep, enduring romantic partnerships under the guise of platonic friendship. These arrangements often passed without open comment as long as they conformed outwardly to societal expectations of female domesticity. Historians still argue whether the apparent invisibility of female same-sex relationships in legal and public discourse meant they were truly less understood or simply intentionally ignored by a society unwilling to acknowledge their existence. Was it a blindness to their reality or a deliberate refusal to name them? You'd come to understand the profound emotional toll of living a life perpetually hidden, the constant vigilance required to avoid exposure, and the joy found in even the smallest moments of shared intimacy, knowing they could be shattered by a single careless word. It made the anxieties of conventional courtship seem almost trivial by comparison, a stark reminder of the immense courage it took to love authentically in a world that refused to acknowledge your truth. The peculiar dating habits of Londoners were peculiar indeed, encompassing a spectrum of experiences that stretched far beyond the polite drawing rooms and chaperone strolls, venturing into the shadowed corners of human desire. From the hushed realities of queer relationships, you now descend into a far grimmer yet undeniably present aspect of 19th century London's peculiar dating landscape: prostitution. This wasn't a choice for most. It was a harsh, often desperate reality for countless women born of poverty, lack of opportunity, and societal vulnerability. Imagine a city where economic despair pushed untold numbers into a clandestine world where survival trumped virtue and hope was a rare commodity. It's a stark counterpoint to the romanticized ideals of courtship. The scale of prostitution in Victorian London was immense. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of women, from young girls to older women, engaged in sex work to survive. They range from the fallen women of the streets, who were the most visible and vulnerable, to those in more respectable brothels or who operated discreetly as mistresses. For many, it was the only alternative to the workhouse starvation or a life of grueling, ill-paid domestic service. The double standard of Victorian morality was glaringly evident here. While women who sold sex were utterly condemned and ostracized, the men who bought it largely escaped social censure. One mainstream historical fact is that the rapid industrialization and urbanization of London created a huge surplus of women migrating to the city for work, many of whom found themselves without employment and thus susceptible to destitution, pushing them into sex work as a means of survival. You might catch glimpses of this world on the gaslit streets, women standing on street corners, or the discreet arrival of carriages at certain houses in wealthier districts. The language used to describe these women was often derogatory: harlots, Magdalens, unfortunates, reflecting society's judgment rather than empathy for their circumstances. For gentlemen, visiting a brothel or keeping a mistress was often seen as a necessary evil or even a rite of passage, a stark contrast to the purity expected from their future wives. It was a societal hypocrisy that permeated every level of London life. Here's a quirky tidbit, if one can call it quirky given the grim reality. Efforts to rehabilitate fallen women, often through Magdalene asylums, were common. These institutions, run by religious or charitable organizations, aim to transform prostitutes into respectable domestic servants through strict discipline and moral instruction. However, the success rates were often low, and many women struggled to re-enter a society that refused to forgive their past. Historians still argue whether the widespread presence of prostitution was a tragic consequence of severe economic inequality and the lack of female agency, or if it was, for some, a desperate form of rebellion against a restrictive, patriarchal society. Was it pure exploitation, or did it offer a semblance of independent survival for those with no other options? You'd come to understand that while courtship narratives focused on purity and propriety, the reality for many in London was far more brutal. The existence of widespread prostitution underscored the immense pressures faced by women in an era of limited choices, a chilling reminder that for many dating and marriage were luxuries beyond their grasp, replaced by the harsh imperative of survival. Stepping away from the raw realities of survival, you now observe how 19th century thought attempted to rationalize and explain emotions through a new lens. Medical views on love. This wasn't about hearts and flowers. It was about brains and nerves, with early medical science attempting to dissect and categorize affection as a physiological phenomenon. Imagine trying to explain your passionate devotion to someone only for a doctor to suggest it's merely a symptom of nervous excitement or a biological imperative. It was an intriguing, if sometimes reductive, attempt to bring the scientific method to matters of the heart. As medical knowledge advanced, albeit slowly and often with erroneous conclusions, there was a growing tendency to view human emotions, including love, as rooted in physical processes. Love might be described as a nervous affliction, a moral malady, or a specific passion that could be either beneficial or detrimental to one's health. Physicians would advise patients against excessive emotional excitement, including intense romantic feelings, believing they could lead to physical ailments like hysteria in women or nervous breakdowns in men. This era saw the rise of phrenology, which claimed to determine character and even romantic compatibility by measuring bumps on the skull, and other pseudosciences attempting to quantify human experience. One mainstream historical fact is that the burgeoning field of psychology and neurology in the 19th century began to shift explanations for human behavior from purely moral or spiritual frameworks to more biological and physiological ones, even if their conclusions were often wildly off the mark. You might encounter advice manuals penned by doctors warning young people against romantic excess, or advising careful selection of a spouse based on perceived physical robustness, all in the name of producing healthy offspring and avoiding degenerate tendencies. It was a bizarre blend of scientific inquiry and moralistic judgment, applying a clinical gaze to the very human experience of falling in love. The idea was to approach marriage, even love, with a calculated, almost dispassionate rationality for the sake of health and societal improvement. Here's a quirky tidbit: some Victorian doctors genuinely believed that excessive study or intellectual pursuits could lead to brain fever or nervous debility in young women, which might in turn make them unsuitable for marriage. Thus, a too clever young lady might find her romantic prospects inadvertently dimmed by her own intellect, seen as a medical liability rather than an asset. Historians still argue whether these medical interpretations of love and emotion serve to control individual behavior and reinforce societal norms, or if they represented a genuine, if flawed, attempt to understand the complexities of human psychology from a scientific perspective. Did it enlighten or merely constrain? You'd realize that even the most ethereal of human experiences, love, was not immune to the era's relentless drive to categorize, analyze, and often control. It made you appreciate that while science offers insights, some things like the inexplicable pull of attraction remain gloriously stubbornly beyond simple medical definition. As the 19th century progressed, you'd begin to witness the emergence of a powerful new force challenging traditional notions of courtship and womanhood, the Minibean. New woman. This wasn't a fashion trend, it was a societal shift, a growing movement of women asserting greater independence, pursuing education, and advocating for broader roles beyond the domestic sphere. Imagine the quiet revolution stirring beneath the corsets and bonnets as women started to question the very foundations of their constrained lives. It certainly brought a fresh, if controversial, dynamic to the peculiar dating habits of London. The new woman was often characterized by her rejection of traditional Victorian femininity. She might ride a bicycle, pursue a university education, smoke cigarettes, and most controversially express opinions on politics and social reform. She was less concerned with securing a husband as her sole purpose in life, and more interested in personal fulfillment, intellectual growth, and even a career. This emerging independence directly challenged the notion that a woman's primary value lay in her purity and domesticity, unsettling the established order of courtship, where a man was the provider and a woman the passive recipient. One mainstream historical fact is that the rise of the new woman was inextricably linked to increasing educational opportunities for women and early feminist movements advocating for greater autonomy and professional prospects. You might encounter this new breed of woman at a university lecture, a suffragette meeting, or perhaps daringly unchaperoned in a public library. Her conversations would be less about polite trivialities and more about substantive issues, her demeanor more confident and self-possessed. For gentlemen, the new woman presented a bewildering paradox, intellectually stimulating perhaps, but also potentially threatening to their traditional roles and expectations of a docile wife. Some men were fascinated, others repelled. The established rules of courtship often felt inadequate when faced with a woman who wasn't playing by the old script. Here's a quirky tidbit: the bicycle became a powerful symbol for the new woman. It offered unprecedented freedom of movement, allowing women to travel independently without the need for a chaperone or a carriage. It even led to changes in fashion, as cumbersome skirts were impractical for cycling, paving the way for more rational dress. Historians still argue whether the new woman genuinely revolutionized courtship practices by demanding more equal partnerships, or if her influence was largely confined to intellectual and upper-middle-class circles, with traditional norms persisting for the majority. Did she truly break the mold, or merely chip away at its edges? You'd feel the subtle tremors of change in the air, a sense that the old ways were beginning to fray. The new woman was a harbinger of a future where dating might involve more than just social contracts and parental approval, hinting at a world where women had a greater say in their own destinies, romantic and otherwise. As the century drew to a close, you'd observe how now technological advancements, particularly the advent of photography, began to subtly weave themselves into the fabric of courtship. While not as transformative as modern dating apps, photography offered new ways for prospective partners to see each other literally before ever meeting, or to memorialize burgeoning affections. Imagine being able to carry a small, tangible image of your beloved with you, a silent reminder of their face when letters were your only other connection. It added a visual dimension to a courtship often conducted through words and whispers. Before photography, portraits were expensive and reserved for the very wealthy. But by the mid-19th century, processes like the daguerreotype and later the carte de visite made photographic portraits more accessible to the burgeoning middle class. For courtship, this meant that a gentleman could acquire a photograph of a lady he was introduced to, or vice versa, allowing for a visual assessment that went beyond vague descriptions. These small, often oval-shaped images could be exchanged as tokens of affection, carried in lockets, or discreetly admired in private. One mainstream historical fact is that the popularization of the carte de visite, a small photographic print mounted on cardstock, allowed for the widespread collection and exchange of portraits, becoming a significant part of social interaction and, by extension, courtship. You might find yourself discreetly studying a small portrait of a potential suitor, trying to discern his character from his expression, or perhaps posing for your own photograph, acutely aware that this image would represent you to someone you might someday marry. The poses were often formal and stiff, reflecting the long exposure times and the solemnity of the occasion. Yet within these rigid poses, there was still a silent conversation occurring, a glimpse into appearance, demeanor, and perhaps a hint of personality. Here's a quirky tidbit: some desperate or overly enthusiastic suitors would send their own photographs, often unbidden, along with a calling card, hoping to make a stronger first impression. This could be seen as charmingly bold by some or incredibly presumptuous by others, depending on the recipient. Historians still argue whether the introduction of photography made courtship more superficial, focusing excessively on physical appearance, or if it simply added a valuable new tool for assessing compatibility and fostering emotional connection before a physical meeting. Did it promote vanity or practicality? You'd come to understand that even in an age of strict decorum, the human desire to see and be seen found new outlets through emerging technologies. Photography offered a quiet revolution, bringing faces closer and adding another layer of visual intrigue to the peculiar, often distant dance of Victorian love. Beyond the formal settings of drawing rooms and the silent exchanges of cards, you discover that leisure activities played an increasingly important, if subtly orchestrated role in Victorian courtship. These shared pastimes offered opportunities for interaction that felt less constrained than formal calls, allowing for glimpses of personality and compatibility in more relaxed environments. Imagine a gentle picnic in the countryside or a leisurely promenade where conversation might flow more freely than over a teacup in a crowded parlor. As the middle class grew and disposable income increased, so too did the popularity of various leisure pursuits. Picnic strolls in public gardens, visits to art galleries, ice skating in winter, or even simple carriage rides became acceptable venues for chaperoned interactions between unmarried men and women. These activities provided a chance for couples to engage in conversation beyond superficial pleasantries, to observe each other's manners in less formal settings, and to potentially discover shared interests. One mainstream historical fact is that the rise of Victorian leisure culture, fueled by industrial prosperity and an emphasis on health and recreation, created new social spaces where courtship could unfold in a more natural, albeit still supervised manner. You might find yourself on a group outing, perhaps, to the newly opened Crystal Palace, or a botanical garden ostensibly for the appreciation of nature or industry, but with the unspoken understanding that potential romantic connections were also being forged. A gentleman might offer his arm for a stroll through the park, a simple gesture that allowed for proximity and a hushed conversation. A lady might subtly assess a gentleman's attentiveness, his conversational wit, and his general demeanor outside the confines of a formal social event. Here's a quirky tidbit: promenading was a hugely popular courtship activity, especially in places like Rotten Row and Hyde Park. It was essentially a public fashion parade and social ritual where people would walk or ride horses ostensibly for exercise, but primarily to see and be seen and to subtly flirt. It was a carefully controlled spectacle of eligibility. Historians still argue whether these leisure activities truly fostered more genuine interactions and deeper understanding between prospective partners, or if they simply provided a different backdrop for the same performative social dances, albeit with slightly less rigid choreography. Did they break down barriers or merely offer a new stage for polite charades? You'd realize that even within the strictures of Victorian society, there was a growing recognition that true compatibility extended beyond lineage and wealth. Shared enjoyment of leisure, a pleasant companion for a stroll, or a kindred spirit at an art exhibition offered a refreshing, if still chaperoned, pathway to connection. Building upon the shared experiences of leisure, you now turn to how music and art became powerful, albeit subtle conduits for romantic inspiration and expression within 19th century London's peculiar dating habits. These were not just pastimes. They were sophisticated languages capable of conveying emotions and ideals that words often could not, shaping perceptions of love and offering avenues for veiled flirtation. Imagine a drawing room concert where a strategically chosen ballad could speak volumes about a performer's hidden affections. Music and art permeated Victorian society, from grand opera houses and public galleries to private drawing rooms where ladies would play the piano or gentlemen would recite poetry. For courtship, these cultural pursuits offered rich ground for demonstrating one's refinement, sensibility, and emotional depth. A gentleman might send a lady a copy of sheet music, hinting at a shared appreciation, or a lady might play a particular piece on the piano, knowing that its lyrics or mood would resonate with a particular admirer. The very act of visiting an art exhibition together could become a subtle opportunity for shared aesthetic appreciation and hushed, meaningful conversation, far less formal than a direct call. One mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian era saw a democratization of access to music and art, partly due to the rise of public institutions and more affordable printing, which allowed these forms of expression to become widely integrated into social life. You might find yourself at a soiree where a young woman with a beautiful singing voice would strategically choose a romantic ballad, her gaze subtly meeting that of a specific gentleman in the room, her voice imbued with unspoken emotion. Or a gentleman might gift a lady a book of engravings depicting idyllic romantic scenes, hoping to convey his own aspirations. These acts were not merely entertainment. They were often carefully choreographed performances of emotion designed to elicit a specific response. The subtle messages carried in a melancholic sonata or a painting depicting a pastoral romance were understood by the discerning. Here's a quirky tidbit: young ladies often learn to play the piano or harp, not just for personal enjoyment, but as a crucial part of their accomplishments, making them more attractive marriage prospects. A gentleman might be invited to turn pages for a lady playing the piano, a seemingly innocent act that allowed for prolonged close proximity and hushed conversation away from the main group. Historians still argue whether the romantic ideals promoted through art and music created unrealistic expectations for love and marriage, leading to disillusionment, or if they genuinely fostered a deeper appreciation for emotional connection in a largely pragmatic society. Did they inspire true romance, or merely a pursuit of idealized fantasy? You'd come to understand that while direct declarations were often curtailed, the artistic endeavors of the age provided a rich symbolic landscape for expressing love, longing, and admiration. It was a world where a shared melody or a poignant painting could convey more than 1,000 carefully chosen words, adding a layer of lyrical beauty to the intricate dance of Victorian courtship. After the long, intricate dance of courtship, the formal pronouncement of engagement, and the subtle communications through flowers and fans, you finally arrive at the pinnacle of 19th century marital traditions, the handwedding ceremony. This wasn't merely a union of two individuals. It was a grand spectacle, a meticulously orchestrated public affirmation of social standing, family legacy, and a new beginning. Imagine the rustle of silk, the hushed murmurs of the congregation, and the immense weight of expectation descending as you walk down the aisle. Victorian wedding ceremonies, especially among the upper and middle classes, were elaborate affairs often involving numerous guests, intricate floral arrangements, and a focus on symbolism and tradition. The bride famously would wear a white gown, a trend popularized by Queen Victoria's own marriage, symbolizing purity and innocence. The ceremony itself would typically take place in a church presided over by a clergyman and would involve the exchange of vows and rings. The legal and religious aspects were intertwined, emphasizing the sanctity and permanence of the union. One mainstream historical fact is that many of the wedding traditions we recognize today, from the white dress to the multi-tiered cake, were firmly established and popularized during the Victorian era, reflecting a growing emphasis on spectacle and sentimental ritual. You'd witness the careful procession, the solemn vows, and the joyous pronouncement of husband and wife. Every detail, from the choice of church to the selection of bridesmaids' dresses, was carefully considered to reflect the family's taste and status. For the newly married couple, this public ceremony was a transformative moment, officially changing their social identity and merging their two lives into one. The sighs of relief from the families, having successfully navigated the treacherous waters of courtship, would be almost audible. Here's a quirky tidbit. It was considered bad luck for the groom to see the bride in her wedding dress before the ceremony on the wedding day itself, a superstition that persists to this day. This added an extra layer of secrecy and anticipation to the grand reveal. Historians still argue whether the increasing elaborateness of Victorian wedding ceremonies reflected a genuine societal emphasis on the sanctity of marriage, or if it primarily served as a public display of wealth and social status, turning personal unions into performative events. Was it about devotion or demonstration? You'd feel the powerful currents of tradition and expectation, recognizing that this was more than just a personal milestone. It was a societal event binding two individuals not only to each other, but also to the larger fabric of Victorian society. It was the culmination of months, sometimes years, of careful maneuvering, all leading to the singular public declaration. With the grand spectacle of the wedding ceremony behind you, the journey of Victorian marriage quickly moves into its next phase. The honeymoon. This wasn't always the exotic escape we envision today. It was a relatively new tradition, evolving from a post-wedding visit to family into a more formalized period of seclusion for the newly married couple, allowing them to adjust to their new status and, crucially, to begin their intimate life together. Imagine the polite awkwardness of these first few days, away from the prying eyes of society, but still under a cloud of societal expectations. Initially, a honeymoon was often a visit to the bride's parents' home or to relatives who couldn't attend the wedding, symbolizing the couple's introduction as a married unit. However, by the mid-19th century, the concept began to shift towards a private trip, usually to a scenic rural location or a seaside town, allowing the couple a period of relative privacy after the intensity of the wedding. It was a time for the couple to deepen their bond, both emotionally and physically, away from the constant scrutiny of family and society. One mainstream historical fact is that the concept of the honeymoon as a distinct post-wedding trip for the couple gained significant traction in the Victorian era, evolving from practical visits to a more romanticized escape. You might imagine the nervous anticipation of a young bride and groom embarking on this journey, perhaps to a quiet country estate or a fashionable coastal resort. For many, it was the first time they truly spent extended, unchaperoned time alone together. The focus was on companionship, gentle affection, and the quiet establishment of intimacy. The cultural expectation was that the honeymoon would be the period in which the marriage was consummated, and the couple truly became one. Here's a quirky tidbit. Early honeymoons often involve visiting friends and relatives, a sort of post-nuptial social tour, rather than a secluded romantic getaway. The idea of a private romantic retreat only gradually gained popularity initially for the upper classes before filtering down. Historians still argue whether the honeymoon as a period of enforced intimacy genuinely fostered stronger marital bonds, or if it sometimes highlighted incompatibilities that had been masked by the formalities of courtship, leading to early disillusionment. Did it build connection or merely reveal cracks? You'd come to understand that the honeymoon, while a moment of escape, was also a subtle transition, a crucial period of adjustment from the public performance of courtship to the private realities of married life. It was a time for two individuals to truly begin their journey as husband and wife, albeit still within the pervasive shadow of Victorian expectations. Settled into the rhythm of married life, you now confront the complex reality of Victorian marital expectations. The unspoken yet deeply ingrained roles and responsibilities that define the daily lives of husbands and wives in 19th century London. This wasn't a partnership of equals in the modern sense. It was a highly structured arrangement with clear divisions of labor and authority, largely dictated by gender and class. Imagine stepping into a predefined role, your daily existence shaped by centuries of tradition with little room for deviation. For the husband, the primary expectation was to be the breadwinner and the head of the household. His role was to provide financial security, protect his family, and manage their public reputation. He was the authority figure, his word often law within the domestic sphere. His duties involved his profession, financial investments, and representing the family and society. One mainstream historical fact is that the concept of separate spheres was dominant, where men inhabited the public sphere of work and politics, while women were confined to the private domestic sphere of the home. For the wife, her sphere was emphatically the home. Her main responsibilities revolved around managing the household, overseeing servants, if the family could afford them, raising children, and providing a comforting moral sanctuary for her husband. She was expected to embody purity, piety, submissiveness, and domesticity, the so-called angel in the house. Her job was to make the home a haven from the harsh realities of the outside world, a place of peace and order. You'd find yourself as the wife meticulously planning meals, supervising staff, and ensuring the smooth running of the domestic machinery, while her husband was off navigating the world of commerce or politics. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian marriage manuals advised wives on the precise temperature their husband's slippers should be warmed to upon his return home, and even how to greet him with the optimal blend of deference and affection. It wasn't just about managing a home, it was about curating an entire emotional atmosphere. Historians still argue whether these clearly delineated marital roles, despite their patriarchal nature, provided a sense of stability and predictability for individuals, or if they stifled personal growth and led to widespread frustration, particularly for women with intellectual or artistic aspirations. Did it create order or merely impose limitations? You'd come to understand that marriage for many was less about individual fulfillment and more about fulfilling a prescribed societal function. It was a partnership of complementary, yet often unequal roles where love might exist, but always within the firm boundaries of expectation. As the decades of the 19th century drew to a close, you'd feel the subtle yet undeniable tremors of change signaling the end of an era for some of these peculiar dating habits. The rigid structures that had governed courtship for so long began to show cracks, giving way to new approaches influenced by social reform, technological innovation, and evolving ideas about gender and individual freedom. Imagine the slow, almost imperceptible loosening of a tightly laced corset, allowing for a hesitant breath of fresh air. The last decades of the century witnessed a gradual liberalization of social norms. The rise of the new woman, whom we touched upon earlier, was a significant catalyst challenging the very idea of a woman's sole purpose being marriage and domesticity. Greater educational opportunities for women increased female participation in the workforce, albeit in limited sectors, and the nascent stirrings of the suffrage movement all contributed to a growing sense of female autonomy. This in turn began to influence how men and women interacted, moving away from purely chaperone-driven encounters towards slightly more independent social engagements. One mainstream historical fact is that the fin de siècle period saw the acceleration of social changes that had been simmering throughout the century, leading to a significant shift in attitudes towards marriage, gender roles, and individual expression. You might observe young couples taking longer, less supervised strolls, perhaps even venturing to public exhibitions or concerts without a watchful eye constantly hovering. The language of flowers and fans, while still understood, became more of a charming affectation than a necessity. Correspondence might become slightly less formal, imbued with a hint more personal candor. There was a burgeoning sense that marriage should ideally be based on genuine companionship and shared interests, not just financial security and social standing. The shift was slow, often resisted, but it was undeniably underway. Here's a quirky tidbit. The increasing popularity of activities like cycling and lawn tennis, which often involved mixed-gender participation, provided new, less formal settings for young people to interact, sometimes with less direct chaperonage than traditional balls or drawing room visits. It was hard to strictly chaperone a fast-paced game of tennis. Historians still argue whether these evolving dating habits represented a true liberation of romantic expression, or if they merely shifted the rules of the game, introducing new forms of subtle social pressure and expectation. Did it lead to greater freedom or simply different constraints? You'd sense the world subtly realigning the foundations of the old order, beginning to crumble, replaced by a growing appetite for individuality and a loosening of the strict social codes that had defined Victorian love. The stage was being set for the vastly different courtship rituals of the 20th century. And so as the gaslights of 19th century London flicker and fade, you're left to reflect on the enduring legacy of Victorian love and its surprising influence on our own romantic lives today. While the specific rituals of calling cards, chaperones, and fan flirting may seem like relics of a bygone era, the underlying anxieties, aspirations, and societal pressures of Victorian courtship still echo in our modern dating landscape. Imagine how much of what you just experienced in a weird way still colors your own search for connection. Many of the deeply ingrained cultural ideas about marriage, romance, and gender roles that we navigate today have their roots firmly planted in the Victorian period. The ideal of romantic love leading to marriage, the emphasis on fidelity, the concept of the nuclear family as the primary unit of society. These were all cemented and popularized during this era. Even our fascination with grand traditional weddings, remember that white dress Queen Victoria made famous, directly stems from this period. The very notion of finding the one often carries a weight of expectation that Victorian sentimentality helped to forge. One mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian era, through its literature, social norms, and emerging popular culture, profoundly shaped Western ideals of romance and marriage, many of which persist in modified forms to this day. You might find yourself in your own dating life still subtly seeking parental approval, consciously or unconsciously considering financial stability in a partner, or even worrying about your reputation in your social circle, all echoes of the Victorian past. We may not use a flower dictionary, but we certainly interpret subtle signals through emojis and texts. We may not have chaperones, but the watchful eyes of social media can sometimes feel just as pervasive. Here's a quirky tidbit. The popularity of Valentine's Day cards truly exploded in the Victorian era, evolving from simple handwritten notes into elaborate mass-produced symbols of affection. It was a commercialization of sentiment that perfectly captured the era's blend of romance and burgeoning consumerism. Historians still argue whether the legacy of Victorian courtship is primarily one of enduring romantic ideals that enrich our lives, or one of lingering, often problematic gendered expectations and social pressures that continue to constrain us. Did it give us a beautiful blueprint for love, or a rigid framework we're still trying to break free from? You've journeyed through a world where love was a delicate, high-stakes game, played out amid strict rules and profound societal expectations. As the final gas light dims and the sounds of carriages fade, you realize that while the peculiarities may have changed, the fundamental human desire for connection, for belonging, and for love remains as timeless and complex as ever. Sweet dreams.